Buzz Aldrin is the last surviving astronaut who walked on the moon. Neil Armstrong died in 2012. Michael Collins died in 2021. That leaves Aldrin, who turned 95 in January 2025 as the only living person who stood on the lunar surface during Apollo 11, the mission that did it first on July 20th, 1969. Aldrin has spoken about that mission continuously for over 5 decades. Most of those conversations followed the same familiar script. The Eagle landed. Armstrong stepped out first. They planted a flag. They collected rocks. They came home. That version is taught in schools and repeated in documentaries, and nobody questions it because it is accurate as far as it goes. What that version leaves out is complexity, not secrets, not suppressed information. Just details that were rarely presented together in simplified accounts. Details that Aldrin has described in multiple interviews over the years. Details that sit in the public mission record and have never been hidden. The mission was more technically demanding, more genuinely uncertain in real time, and richer in documented experience than the condensed version suggests. Understanding what Aldrin has consistently described requires understanding what the mission actually was, from the moment it left the ground to the moment it hit the water. What the mission actually was, from start to finish. Apollo 11 launched from Kennedy Space Center on July 16, 1969, at 9:32 in the morning Eastern Time. The crew was Armstrong as commander, Collins as command module pilot, and Aldrin as lunar module pilot. The mission lasted just over 8 days. The spacecraft traveled about 239,000 miles from Earth to the Moon. The journey out took roughly 4 days. During that time, the crew was doing systems checks, eating scheduled meals, sleeping in shifts, and communicating with Mission Control in Houston. The communications were not private. Every transmission was recorded. The crew knew this. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module called Eagle and separated from Collins, who stayed in the command module, orbiting above. The descent to the surface did not go exactly as planned. During the final approach, the guidance computer began throwing alarm codes. The specific errors were 1202 and 1201 alarms, indicating the computer was overloaded. Mission Control had a 26-year-old software engineer, Jack Garman, in the back room who had, weeks before the mission, prepared a handwritten list of which alarm codes were safe to fly through. The 1202 alarm was on that list. Flight Director Gene Kranz gave the call to continue. The landing site itself was a problem. The computer was guiding Eagle toward a crater about the size of a football field ringed with boulders. Armstrong took manual control and flew past it, burning fuel as he looked for somewhere flat. He found a spot and set down with roughly 20 to 30 seconds of usable fuel remaining in the descent stage. His words to Houston were, "The Eagle has landed." Armstrong stepped onto the surface at 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th. Aldrin followed about 20 minutes later. They were outside for just over 2.5 hours. During that time, they collected 47 pounds of lunar material, deployed scientific instruments, took photographs, and planted the flag. The flag had a horizontal rod along the top to keep it extended because there is no wind on the moon to make it wave. They slept inside the lunar module on the surface. The next day, they lifted off and rejoined Collins in orbit. The return trip took another 4 days. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th. The crew was then kept in biological quarantine for 21 days in Houston because nobody was certain there was no contamination risk from lunar material. That is the version everyone knows. What the crew documented during the outbound journey and how that documentation sat in technical records without reaching general public awareness for decades is where this story develops next. The thing they saw on the way there. On the 3rd day of the mission, somewhere between Earth and the Moon, the crew observed something traveling alongside their spacecraft that they could not immediately identify. The observation is documented in the mission record, though its interpretation has been debated and is largely understood today. The crew initially thought it might be the S-4B, the third stage of the Saturn V rocket that had been jettisoned earlier in the mission. That would have been the straightforward explanation. The problem was that Mission Control confirmed the S-4B was over 6,000 miles away at the time. It was not what they were looking at. Aldrin described the object in the 2005 documentary Spacecraft as an L-shaped formation of light. He said the crew debated how to raise it with Mission Control, not because they wanted to obscure it, but because they did not want to generate alarm or uncontrolled media coverage during the most closely watched mission in human history. They asked Mission Control about the S-4B's location as a way of ruling it out, and they did. The most widely accepted explanation is that what they saw was reflective debris from the spacecraft itself, specifically the 4 panels jettisoned when the spacecraft separated from the S-4B. These panels had enclosed the lunar module during launch and would have traveled at a similar velocity and trajectory to the spacecraft for a period before gradually drifting away. Depending on how they tumbled and reflected sunlight, they could have appeared as an unusual or L-shaped formation of light. Aldrin himself has acknowledged this explanation as the most likely. He has not dismissed it or pushed against it. What Aldrin has consistently said is that the crew observed something they could not identify at the time, that it was not their own rocket stage, and that the honest record of the mission should include that fact. He has stated this in multiple interviews over the years. The observation was never hidden. It was not widely discussed outside technical records, which is a different thing entirely. That distinction matters, because the rest of what the mission record contains follows the same pattern, documented, available, and rarely presented in terms that general audiences would encounter. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Apollo 11 technical crew debrief runs to hundreds of pages. It covers everything, from the performance of specific switches to the taste of the food and the psychological experience of looking at Earth from 239,000 miles away. Most of it has been publicly available for decades. Very little of it has been read by anyone outside aerospace research. One thing the debrief documents is sound. During the first sleep period on the lunar surface, both Armstrong and Aldrin reported hearing banging and cracking noises coming from outside, or from the structure of the spacecraft itself. Engineers later confirmed these sounds were caused by thermal expansion of the spacecraft structure as it transitioned between extreme heat in sunlight and extreme cold in shadow. Temperatures on the moon swing from roughly 260 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight to minus 280 degrees Fahrenheit in shadow. A metal structure undergoing that kind of shift makes noise. The crew found it notable enough to document in detail. It does not appear in the short public version of the mission at all. The debrief also captures what Collins described as a sense of solitude unlike anything he had anticipated. Collins spent the portions of the mission when Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface entirely alone in the command module, orbiting the moon roughly every 2 hours. When he passed over the far side, he lost all radio contact with the Earth for about 48 minutes out of every orbit. He was more isolated from other human beings than any person had ever been. He wrote about it extensively in his 1974 memoir, Carrying the Fire, which many astronaut historians consider the most honest first-person account of the Apollo program. He describes the far side silence not as frightening, but as profound in a way he struggled to put into words. None of this changes what the mission accomplished. What it adds is texture to an event that gets condensed for clarity in education and media, condensed to a few famous sentences and a set of photographs. The crew was in an environment no human had ever occupied. They were in a spacecraft with less computing power than a modern pocket calculator and farther from any help than humans had ever traveled. What they documented during those 8 days is part of the public record. It is just rarely presented alongside the famous parts. Why Aldrin chose the moments he did to speak about some of it more directly is its own thread worth following. Why some of this took so long to reach general audiences. Aldrin has given interviews continuously since 1969. So why did certain parts of what the crew experienced not feature clearly in public conversation for so long? Part of the answer is institutional. NASA in 1969 was operating under significant public and political scrutiny. The Apollo program existed in direct competition with the Soviet space program, and any crew statement that sounded ambiguous would have attracted immediate outside attention. The crew understood this. They had been trained not just as pilots and engineers, but as representatives of a national achievement. The technical debriefs were thorough and honest. The public-facing statements were measured. Part of the answer is personal. Aldrin has spoken openly about the depression he experienced after returning from the moon. He had spent his entire life working toward a goal and achieved it at 39, then had to work out what followed. He struggled through much of the 1970s. His memoir, Return to Earth, published in 1973, was unusually candid for an astronaut of that era. But during that period, he was not positioned to be the calm, systematic narrator of mission nuance that he became later. By the time he reached his 80s, the circumstances had changed. Armstrong was gone. Collins was gone. The mission had become history. Aldrin began speaking more directly about what the full record showed, including the unidentified observation and other aspects of the mission that had been condensed out of the popular account. In 2014, in a Reddit AMA, Aldrin addressed the crew's observation directly, described it in straightforward terms, and identified the jettisoned panels as the most probable explanation. He did not frame it as a mystery or a late revelation. He framed it as a factual account of what happened. The coverage that followed treated it as more dramatic than he did. That difference illustrates the gap between what Aldrin was actually saying and what audiences were primed to hear. What the mission produced scientifically is a separate layer of the story, and it is one that took even longer to reach public understanding. What the moon rocks actually showed. The roughly 47 pounds of lunar material the crew brought back went to NASA's Lunar Receiving Laboratory in Houston. After the quarantine period ended, samples were distributed to scientists around the world. What those rocks showed helped reshape the scientific understanding of how the moon formed. Before Apollo, there were three main competing theories for the moon's origin. It might have formed alongside Earth from the same cloud of material. It might have been captured by Earth's gravity from elsewhere in the solar system. Or it might have separated from Earth in some ancient event. The Apollo samples did not fit neatly with any of these. What they showed was that the moon's oxygen isotope ratios were essentially identical to Earth's, which made the capture theory unlikely, since bodies from elsewhere in the solar system tend to carry different isotope signatures. But the moon also lacks water and certain volatile elements present on Earth, which complicated the simultaneous formation model. The evidence from Apollo 11 and subsequent missions helped support and refine what became the leading theory, the giant impact hypothesis. The current scientific consensus is that roughly 4.5 billion years ago, a body approximately the size of Mars, which researchers call Theia, struck the early Earth, and the moon formed from the resulting debris. The Apollo samples were among the first physical evidence that made this model possible to develop. That is a significant scientific result from a 2.5-hour walk on the surface. It also took years of analysis across multiple research groups to establish, which may partly explain why it rarely appears in the popular version of what Apollo 11 achieved. When you add it to everything else the mission produced, the picture that emerges is considerably larger than the one that fits on a commemorative poster. What the full picture shows, the Apollo 11 mission was more complex and technically demanding than it is often summarized. It was an 8-day operation involving 3 people who documented experiences that took years to fully analyze and have been stated in multiple interviews and technical records over time without ever quite reaching general audiences with the weight they deserve. The observation the crew made on the 3rd day of the mission is in the record. The explanation involving jettisoned panels is widely accepted. Aldrin has said so himself consistently. The thermal noises on the lunar surface were confirmed as structural. Collins' isolation on the far side of the moon is in his memoir and his debrief. The computer alarms during the landing and the narrow fuel margin at touchdown are in the mission record. Armstrong's manual override to avoid the boulder field is in the record. None of these are concealed. They are details condensed for clarity in education and media, details that have always been available to anyone who looked at the primary sources. Aldrin, at 95, is the only living person who was on that spacecraft. What he has described, consistently over many years, is that the mission was more complex and technically demanding than the condensed version suggests. He is not asking anyone to believe anything extraordinary. He is asking for the full documented complexity of what actually happened to be part of how the mission is understood, because he was there, and that is what it was. The vehicles being built right now to return to the moon will carry sensors and cameras the Apollo crew could not have imagined. What they find when they get there will add new layers to a picture that, even after 56 years, is still being filled in. The Mariana Trench gets more detailed every time a drone goes down to look. The moon, it turns out, works the same way. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.